This is Ellen Morgan with a history of books and printmaking with a presentation on movable type. So before we get started talking about movable type itself, I think it's important that we spend some time looking about the history of early printing methods. Namely, this is woodblock printing or xylography. This is a technique that was used throughout Asia. In particular, we see it in China, Japan, and Korea. And the wood block that was carved, instead of carving the characters into the wood, you would carve away the excess wood until you were left with the letters or the images that you desired. The whole block could then be inked and then pressed onto either paper or textiles. We do today still have some surviving examples set on silk. And this left you with mostly an exact copy. The wood does wear down over time or it chips. And there can be human error involved in the making of the woodblock. So each copy is not necessarily perfect. So here we see an example of a Chinese woodblock print. So this entire image would have been carved out at one time. And once it had been carved, it could then be reproduced over and over again until the wood wear down. More on some early printing. Some obvious problems we have are that once an item was carved, it could not be modified. Let's see. Also, we see that the wood wears out much more quickly than the metal. It's also not exactly the best to use with Chinese and other Asian languages because there are so many characters and so many combinations of characters that it makes it really complex when you're doing woodblock printing. They were the first to use movable type, but I think because of this difficulty is one reason we see that it doesn't catch on necessarily as well as it did in Europe and other parts of the world later on. Also, culturally in Asia, there is value in the art form of calligraphy and handwriting itself, rather than just a focus on mass dissemination, which is another part of the reason we don't see printing take off as much as it did in Asia as other parts of the world. And it was very much something that was for the few. It was for the upper class, for merchants. We today find a lot of records of business, but this is not the kind of thing that the average person would necessarily have access to. And moving on to Europe, we do still see woodblock printing in Europe. We also see a lot of the same problems with woodblock printing in Europe as we did in Asia, mostly to do with durability. Woodblock printing in Europe was used frequently for illustrations rather than for text. At this time, we had paper being made from linen rags. So most of the printing would be on paper made from the rags rather than a textile like silk. And the things that were being printed were fairly simple and on a relatively small scale. So we're seeing things like playing cards, things like calendars and small pamphlets. Things that are small, they're simple, they're relatively easy to reproduce again and again. We also have a high demand for religious and educational texts at the time, and these things were not for the everyman. They were definitely for the upper classes, those involved in the hierarchy of religion and education. We see this particularly with the demand for manuscripts. So here's an example of a medieval illuminated manuscript. You can see that each letter is painstakingly done, and then when the manuscript was finished, an artist would go back and add these really incredible touches like we see in the capital letters. So they're beautiful, but we obviously run into some problems with things like this. Mostly that mass production is going to be really difficult to do with a manuscript. They're all copied by hand. It's extremely labor intensive. It's also very slow and costs a lot of money to do. And it's incredibly susceptible to human error of the monk himself who's making the copy. So maybe he might have misheard what was being read out loud or was rushing to catch up. So no two manuscripts are going to be exactly the same. They were of incredibly high quality, but were definitely, again, for the few, towards the top of society. Not your average person would have access to things like illuminated manuscripts. This then brings us to Gutenberg, and it sets the scene for what printing and writing was like at the time of Johann Gutenberg when he made his printing press. The printing press took years for him to develop, almost a lifetime. We see it sometime in the 1440s or 50s. And the first item that he printed was a massive 2-volume Bible set done in the style of a manuscript. So he had the print designed to look as if it were handwritten. We have about 48 surviving Gutenberg Bibles left. Out of an initial run, we think of about 200, which all things considered is not too bad. That's a pretty good number to still have. A lot of the work he did had to be done in secrecy or isolation. There was a lot of competition at the time, people trying to accomplish similar things. So for his own best interest, it was best to keep it on the down low. Another huge contribution he has is the advent of movable type, metal movable type. These things had to be, the letters themselves and the molds for the letters had to be painstakingly produced, many copies of the same letter. So not just the 26 letters and a set of capitals. You needed enough letters to print about 3 pages at the same time. So here we have an example of a Gutenberg Bible, a surviving Gutenberg Bible, and you can tell by looking at the precision in the columns and the way that each letter was formed that it looks a lot like a hand-done manuscript. And a lot of care and quality went into it. The fact that we have so many surviving today shows the quality of materials that he used to make it. So talking about movable type specifically, the big deal with movable type is that it allows much more easily for mass production of items and for exact copies. So different people in different places know that they're going to be reading the exact same item. The time and energy that was spent making the molds and letters means that you do a lot of initial work to get it set up, but once it's finished, you don't have to redo that work over and over again. Once you have the letters made, as you can see in this image up in the corner, you can rearrange them any way you want and continue to use them. And because they're made out of metal, they last much longer than those made out of wood. He also chose to produce large items like the Bible and educational material, but at the same time continued to print smaller items like almanacs and calendars in order just practically to offset the costs of making these bigger items and to make some money to keep the shop running in the meantime. And for his Bibles in particular, it took about 290 characters required just to print 3 pages at the same time. So it gives you sort of a sense of the scale that we're looking at. More about movable type. We see that this works really well with the European alphabets because there are fewer characters and less complex characters than we see in the Asian languages. It's much more conducive to working with movable type. We mentioned already that they're much more durable. They don't wear down nearly as often as wood, and they don't need to be replaced. And Gutenberg himself had a background in goldsmithing, which is expertise he would have needed in order to make these very small, very precise letters. So we see printing combining many different kinds of industries and skills. We have papermaking, carpentry, goldsmithing, all of these things working together to produce what we know now as printed material. But despite this, we do still see mistakes happening, particularly in the first 10 years or so of printed material, which is commonly referred to as incunabula, which is from the Latin, from the cradle, meaning the early years of printing. There was still a lot of troubleshooting going on, perhaps spelling mistakes, things aligned improperly. So it doesn't entirely remove human error from the equation, but it makes it much simpler to fix. Instead of redoing the entire work, you just have to go back and move a few of the letters around. And we see some really broad and long-lasting impacts of movable type in the printing press in general. Unfortunately, as with so many inventions, Gutenberg himself did not benefit as much from his invention as those who came after him would. We see that impact much more in later generations and even in society today. In the big picture, we have the press and movable type helping to initiate an increase of literacy across society, not just in the upper classes. Books could be more easily acquired. They were much more for everybody. As printing caught on, it got to be, the works were made in various vernaculars in different languages. So if you wanted to read something, you didn't have to learn Latin or another foreign language. And these books produced in vernacular would then go on to influence which languages became dominant in particular areas. We also see a greater dissemination of knowledge. It was easier to spread access to theologies or scientific discoveries and know that what you're reading is an exact copy of what the author produced. So we have much more access to religious and scientific information spreading among many more different people. We also start to see books as the first mass-produced commodities. Again, very gradually we see the development of publishing houses, people who can make a living as authors, whether these printing presses are independent or state-controlled. It grows as its own industry in its own right. And this sets the stage for really the information-based society that we have even today. It's frequently taken for granted how we have so much access to exact copies of all different kinds of information that's so readily available in different formats, be it print or electronic, ready for downloading. But because of movable type and the printing press, we see now that replications of exact copies of information are the norm rather than the exception. So really the importance of movable type cannot be overstated. And here are some reference pages, both for the information and for the images we see throughout the presentation.